Welcome to week 8, our last week. There is one remaining topic that we will talk about, and in a separate video I'll tell you about all the interesting things that we didn't get to cover, but I'll give you pointers for ways in which you can pursue them. So this one thing that we haven't yet talked about that I do want to talk about is network resilience. And this is basically the question of so far we've been nice to our networks, we've observed them and seen the fascinating properties. But in the real world, networks can be vulnerable. And it's actually rather important to understand how resilient they are to two different kinds of losses. They can lose nodes, this is node percolation, or they could lose edges, so nodes losing the ability to communicate with one another. This is edge percolation. So you want to understand how those two things affect how the network can function. Then we're going to look at particular topologies, namely scale-free networks, and see how random failure of nodes differs from targeted attack. That is, random failure might just occur naturally, but targeted attack, if you have an adversary, they're choosing which nodes they want to take out. So how does the network do in one scenario versus the other, and how does this depend on its original topology? And finally, we'll talk about resilience in real-world networks, in one in particular, and that is the US power grid. Let's go back to the question of whether we're removing nodes or edges. This has a mapping to lattice percolation, and you can either have here edge percolation, that is, here the nodes are these intersections, and you're just asking whether the nodes are connected via these edges, and what you're looking for is at what point does a giant component emerge. But you also may be asking, what is the path length? Because if you remember, right at the percolation threshold, these paths can be rather long. And if we're thinking about what makes a network function, it is that everyone is reachable from any other node. This has implications for information flow. But we also saw, for example, in the small world experiment, that long paths have not that high of a probability of getting the information through. So also having short path lengths between nodes is important. So we want to basically check both. The other type of percolation is node percolation, and here we've kind of switched representations a bit because each of these squares is a node and it's simply connected to the 4 closest neighbors, and now each of those squares is either occupied or not, and we're going to see what effect that has on the connected clusters. So first, edge percolation. We're going to remove each edge with probability 1 minus p, meaning that each edge is there actually with probability p, and this just is corresponding to the random failure of links. And if we want to target the attack, we're going to ask which links should we remove such that we have to do the fewest removals and inflict the most damage in terms of how much the giant component shrinks and what the average shortest path is within the component. And if you think about what strategies you might want to use, well, we've basically already done this when we were using the betweenness algorithm for community finding. Remember, the rationale there was that if we remove high betweenness edges, the removal of these edges is most likely to break up the network into communities because a lot of shortest paths went through them. So removing precisely those edges is going to most rapidly break up the network. And in a way, this percolation is actually the reverse of these attacks are the reverse of the process that we already looked at, which was adding edges, right? We started out with a fixed number of nodes, and then we added the edges one by one, and we just saw at one point, we got these small components, and then at some point we got this largish, stringy, giant component, and then the network densified from there on. And when we looked at the size of the giant component, it looked something like this, where you just don't have a giant component, and then right around average degree of 1 for each node, you get the emergence of the giant component. So now we're just doing the reverse, which is we're starting out with the network at some stage, at some density, and then we're removing the edges and we're seeing the effect. At what point does the network break up? So just to check our understanding, if you had this network here where each node has an average degree of 4.6 approximately, and you removed a fourth of the edges, and here I've highlighted a fourth, by how much would you reduce the size of the giant component? If we look at this, we can see that actually the giant component wasn't even really affected. And that is because if we remove a quarter of the edges, we drop from an average degree of 4 point something to an average degree of 3, which is still well above the percolation threshold, and we still have most of the network intact. Now let's switch over to removing nodes instead of removing edges. If you remember, we did, I think in the assignment or perhaps in the lecture, this percolation in a regular lattice, and this reminds you of water percolating through soil, which is how the problem was originally formulated. And that is, if there are enough gaps, enough unoccupied sites, and these are actually going to be our nodes, in the soil, and they merge together, water can actually seep through. And at some point, we're going to get to this critical threshold, at which point the water can seep through. And after that, of course, more and more water can seep through. But basically, at some proportion of nodes present, the network starts to percolate. Now let's do the same thing in networks as opposed to a lattice. Here I'm showing you the Gnutella peer-to-peer file sharing network, which you have already encountered in your Small Worlds homework. And so this is, over a decade old, but one characteristic of this network is that there were a lot of nodes with low bandwidth, even some on dial-up modems, and some nodes who had high bandwidth. And so you get this hub and spoke kind of structure, and naturally, a lot of high degree nodes who are also connected to each other. So what happens if we remove a random fraction of those nodes? Well, the network actually barely notices. So here we've removed 20%, a fifth of the nodes at random, and it looks basically the same. If we look at the size of the giant component, the only thing it's really lost are those nodes that we removed. So what happened? If you look at this network, you'll realize that there are lots and lots of nodes with degree 1. And since this is just a random attack, meaning that nodes are selected at random, very likely you're going to hit the 1 degree nodes and not the few hubs. And so removing they're called leaf nodes, nodes of degree 1, because they're just kind of dangling off the network, doesn't really affect the network that much. On the other hand, if you go ahead and target nodes of your choosing, so here we've targeted the high degree nodes, you would get similar and even better results if you targeted the high betweenness nodes, but here, just for simplicity, we're doing high degree. Well, removing just the 22 most connected nodes, so that's about 3% of the nodes, and the giant component drops in size almost by a half. So why is removing high degree nodes more effective? Is it because it removes more nodes, because it removes more edges, or because it targets the periphery, that is the outskirts of the network? Hopefully what you realized is that if you remove high degree nodes, you actually remove a whole bunch of edges as well. And so you have much higher impact by removing those hubs. And here is a diagram from a paper by Rekha Albert, Haowen Zhang, and Laszlo Barabashi, where they studied exponential networks. So this could be the Erdős-Rényi random graph, or it could be a network that is grown randomly but without preferential attachment. And it doesn't matter if you attack with purpose or if it's just random failure, but what you see is that you start out with a giant component, and then at some point it's broken up significantly, and eventually you have mostly very small components, right, once you're below the percolation threshold. On the other hand, the scale-free network is only going to behave like this if there's targeted attack. That is, you really need to get those hubs in order to get it to break up like this. Otherwise, with random failure, all that happens is that you keep hitting those low degree nodes just by chance, and the giant component is going to shrink modestly and eventually, shrink even more, but you'll likely have it throughout this sort of random failure process. Besides just looking at the size of the giant component, what we also mentioned matters is how many hops it is from one node to any other. What we see for the scale-free network is that if you have random failure, there's almost no effect on the average shortest path, which is good. However, the story is quite different for purposeful attack. This is where you're taking out the hubs. The average shortest path actually starts to grow significantly even while you're removing a relatively small fraction of the nodes. On the other hand, if we look at the exponential network, the Erdős-Rényi random graph, then both failure and attack have almost no effect, just a very slight effect on the average shortest path. If we look at two empirical networks, we see this confirmed. So both the physical internet and the World Wide Web are unaffected by random failure. These are the blue squares here. And their average shortest path rises quite dramatically once you start targeting the hubs specifically. So far, we have treated the degree distribution of the network as the most important factor in how resilient the network is going to be. But we've paid no attention to how those nodes are actually wired together. And one simple way of capturing who is wired to whom is to look at assortativity, specifically degree assortativity. In general, assortativity could just mean whether like nodes associate with like. When we're talking about degree assortativity, we're looking at whether nodes who are social, have lots of connections, are connected to other nodes who are likewise social, or is it the reverse? Is it that the hubs are associated with the hermits, the people who have very few connections? And if we look at different kinds of networks, here's an example of an assortative network where you have the hubs connecting to other hubs and the low-degree nodes connecting to other low-degree nodes. Here, perhaps this topology is random. It reminds you of when we grew a preferential attachment network. And here, the network is disassortative. So the hubs like the low-degree nodes, and basically captures it. There are different ways in which you can capture this. So one is to actually enumerate all possible pairings of degrees across the edges and look at the same property in a randomized network to see, and the reason why I randomize is just to see, sometimes at random you'll have a high degree node connecting to a low degree node. So if you were to do this for the internet, here's what you would see. You would see that these medium hubs, and having 30 connections is not that medium, tend to be connected with relatively low degree nodes, and the low degree nodes actually end up being connected with even the the highest hubs, versus the highest hubs tend to be connected either with low degree nodes or with other, very high degree hubs. So it gives you a more rich representation of who is connecting to whom. You can simplify this, right? This was a two a 2D histogram in essence, almost a 3D plot, right? The coloring was the third dimension. We can reduce this to a 2D plot if we look at the degree of the node and then look at the average degree of the neighbors. And in fact, it gives you extra sensitivity. Do you remember how I said you can test your models by doing additional measurements? Well, here's an additional measurement that, in fact, the regular Barabashi-Albert preferential attachment model, it fails. It has no trend in the average degree of the neighbor as a function of the degree of the node. But if we look at the physical internet, it says that the average degree of the neighbor falls the higher the degree of the node. And so it wasn't until the fitness model, which came just a year later, within a year, where the probability that a node gets one of those new edges associated with a new node, it depends not just on the degree of the node, but also its inherent fitness, that you get this kind of relationship which is much closer to what you observe in real life. And there's I don't know if you can hear the crow, but it wants to chime in on this presentation as well. And then to simplify even more, you can just look at a single number, which is over all the edges, you just take the correlation between the degrees of the nodes on either side. So for example, for the internet, you get this slight disassortativity of minus 0.2. And of course, you do lose some information. For example, yes, on average, the network is disassortative, but we also saw that for the highest degree nodes, they were actually likely to both be connected to each other and to the very low degree nodes, and it was the middle that was the missing chunk. Still, it's nice to just be able to characterize this property with a single number. So if you'd like a single number, then you can just look at this correlation. I mentioned that you can talk about assortative mixing more generally. So if you were talking about social ties, you may be looking at race and income and gender and age. You can look at food webs, herbivores and carnivores. I'm assuming in the food web, it might be a bit disassortative there. And we already discussed the internet in terms of the degree, but maybe really what is the property that they're really connecting on is the type of node that they are, whether they're high-level connectivity providers, internet service providers, or consumers. And in general, when you're talking about social networks, you talk about homophily. The term birds of a feather flock together is saying exactly this, that individuals in some scenarios will tend to associate on observable characteristics, for example, age and gender. To check our understanding, will a network with positive or negative degree assortativity be more resilient to attack? And for this, let's go to NetLogo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a topology, and this network is going to be disassortative. That is, the high degree nodes are going to be connected to the low degree nodes, and the way that I did this was by taking the originally grown network and then rewiring. And the rewiring is accepted if it, in this case, decreases assortativity and not accepted otherwise. So let's try and attack this. And the way that we're going to attack it is we're going to select the 10 highest degree nodes, and we observe what happens to the network. Now let's grow an assortative network. and you should see the high degree nodes clumping together and the low degree nodes being pushed out to the periphery. And hopefully it will finish rewiring soon. But definitely you see this dense central core. Now we're going to attack, and we can observe what happens. And here the red nodes are in the giant component. So going back to our presentation, hopefully what you saw was that in the case of assortative mixing, there was very little impact. We disconnected these parts of the network, but in general, there was so much redundancy in that central core that we didn't actually end up breaking up the network. In the disassortative case, however, a lot of these nodes were connected just to the hubs, and so once the hubs were removed, the network was pretty much broken up with the removal of just 10 nodes. But the question might be, is it really that simple? Is it just that you can map out the network, figure out which nodes to target, and you're done? Well, when some very smart physicists started doing this on, for example, the physical topology of the internet, computer scientists didn't really take it that seriously because they said, well, it's how these ISPs or how these different nodes are connected is dynamic. So you have routing tables, and depending on where the packets are getting through and where they're not, the routing tables are continuously updated. So you can in fact inflict what you think is a lot of damage, and the network simply organically adapts to what is going on. Similarly, it would be nice, ideally, you map out a terrorist network or a criminal network, for example, individuals involved in the drug trade. However, there was recently a report, the 10-year-long effort by the US to target exactly this kind of drug trade network. And they found that no matter how many of those nodes they removed by incarcerating them, sending them to prison, the network adapted. Just new people came in and filled that space. So it's not that the network is sitting there and saying, oh, okay, I lost this node, I'm not going to do anything about it. They're very dynamic. And so yes, perhaps during a short time period, if you can simultaneously take out a lot of the nodes and the network has no way of replacing them, then you can predict, that you're going to be able to break up the network into small non-functioning parts. But in general, you have to be careful about this particular assumption, what power you have to bring the network down. So let's look at a particular example, and that is of the power grid. Here again, we're going to dismiss some assumptions that we had with other networks, and we're going to introduce some new simplifying assumptions. Here, what we're talking about is that where the electricity is produced is not always where it is consumed, and you need intermediate distribution, actually transmission stations that will bring the power from the generators to the kind of end distribution stations that then deliver the electricity locally to customers. And as you probably are aware, failures of the power grid can be quite dramatic. So if you have a power plant go down or one station go down and at one location, you can get what's called a cascading failure, where entire swaths of the country will be without power, because this is a network, and what happens at one node actually influences what happens at to the other nodes. So in a way, here the damage is greater. It's not that removing one node, now you've lost the paths that go through that node and the edges involved with that node. because electricity flows, basically simultaneously through all possible paths, one removal of one node actually affects all of the rest of the network to a greater or lesser extent. So let's see how that happens. What happens is that when a node goes out, it will have some load and a capacity, and say that the load exceeds the capacity, the node will fail, and now its load is redistributed around to its neighbors. So I'll just follow this paper by Kinney et al. And this is Rekha Albert from the Barabashi and Albert model who's on this paper as well. So again, the nodes are generators, transmission substations, and distribution substations. And the edges are these high voltage transmission lines. And there are basically thousands of these nodes and about 20,000 edges. So what happens? Well, first of all, you see this straight line, and you might think, oh, that's a power law. Well, no, it's not. Actually, the power grid is an exponential network, and you can tell because this is a linear axis, and this is logarithmic. And so that means that there aren't really these huge hubs, right? The highest degree node has fewer than 25 connections, which kind of makes sense. Can you really imagine one of these transmission stations being wired to 1,000 others, right? You just can't really imagine this topology of high voltage wires really doing that. So we have an exponential network, and now we need to know where is the electricity flowing. So it's not just that it flows through all paths. So we're going to see which paths is it really flowing through depending on their capacity. And so we're going to have certain efficiency of the edge, and we can compare, and then we have the efficiency of the path that is composed of a bunch of these edges. And the simplifying assumption in the end is that we're going to assume it only goes along the most efficient path, but in practice it actually goes through all of them, but primarily through the high efficiency one. So we can compare three different paths. Path A has 2 edges, and each of those edges has efficiency 0.5, which gives the efficiency of the path of 1/4. Path B has 3 edges, each with efficiency 0.5, which gives the efficiency of the path as 1/6. And then path C has 2 edges, one with efficiency 0 and the other with efficiency 1. And the efficiency of the whole path is 0, because if part of the path lets no electricity through, then that path lets no electricity through. And it's nice that instead of averaging these efficiencies, we have that the shorter path is more efficient. So we can then look at the efficiency of the overall network, and we're going to just look at all the paths between all the generating stations and all the kind of end distribution stations. And we're going to look at the efficiency of the most efficient path between I and J, and that's how we'll measure how well the network as a whole is doing in delivering the electricity. What we're also going to say is that the capacity of each node is proportional to its initial load times alpha, and you want alpha to be greater than 1 because you want its capacity to be greater than its initial load. And then what's going to happen as the dynamics unfold is that if the load is less than the capacity, then the neighbors are unaffected, right? The node is functioning as usual, and the neighbors are just carrying whatever they would normally be carrying. However, if the load of this node exceeds the node's capacity, then that node shuts down temporarily. As long as the capacity, as long as the load exceeds the capacity, it'll be in a degraded state, and instead its neighbors are going to have to carry some of the load, which is going to degrade their efficiency by this factor, which is how much the original node was overloaded. And so this is kind of this distribution which then can produce the cascading failure. One node exceeding its capacity now puts that load on its neighbors, who in turn can fail, and those nodes in turn might then distribute their load to their neighbors, etc. And what in this paper they measured, simulating but on the real topology, is what happens if you just remove nodes at random. So you just assume one or more of them are failed for some reason, and this is as you target, you get to pick which one fails, and you can see that this is worse because the network efficiency drops down further, and this is random. And here is the overload tolerance. So just look at this figure closely and see what you can conclude about the network efficiency as a function of this overload tolerance that you've given to the network. So specifically, the quiz question is, how much higher would the capacity, the average capacity of each node need to be relative to the initial load in order for the network to be basically unaffected by the removal, either targeted removal of a node or a random failure of such a node? So hopefully what you saw was that increasing the average capacity just 30% or 40% above the typical load, what we call the initial load, would render the network relatively safe to the random and even targeted failure of a particular node. Now, why did in the past these cascading failures occur? Well, that was because power companies had little incentive to provide this additional capacity, right? Because they were kind of charging for the load they were carrying, not for additional capacity they could provide, which would kick in situations where there were failures. But research such as this can show that that additional capacity need not be that large, and it would still render the network pretty resilient to failure. Now, to recap, we saw that resilience really depends on topology, and this was not just the degree distribution, which then rendered the network, say, more resilient to random attack if the degree distribution was skewed, but less resilient to targeted attack in that case. But it also depends on what happens when a node fails. It could be that that's it, just a node fails, but all the other nodes are unaffected, or it can have this cascading effect, for example, what we see with the power grid, or it can have the opposite effect, which is what we saw with, say, crime networks, where the node is quickly replaced. In fact, someone was probably eagerly waiting to occupy that spot, and so the damage isn't even as bad as, having that node no longer there. As we part, I'd like to congratulate you for sticking with this course throughout its 8 weeks. I hope that you have a good sense about networks. What I hope you got out of it is understanding what are the key properties of empirically observed networks, what are the processes that shape them, that help us to understand what those empirical numbers mean, and what implications this has for various functions that the network is supposed to be carrying out. For example, whether it's enabling people to communicate or to search and find one another, or some of the cool and unusual applications where the nodes might be different products in a product space that different countries participate and compete in. At the same time, we've, in a sense, just scratched the surface of all of the wonderful research and learning that you can do in this area. One thing that I haven't covered at all are biological networks. And this is one of the largest application areas with many fascinating findings, ranging from understanding how different functions have evolved to how cells work to I mean, it just goes on and on. It's really, I mean, things like the relationship between genetics and disease. All of this now is heavily influenced by uh, our understanding of how things are networked together. Similarly, there's so many other application areas that we haven't, that you wouldn't even imagine. For example, network analysis of space that architects use to understand which spaces are going to be conducive to individuals flowing through, which spaces are going to allow them to communicate, just things of that sort. We also have not used some of the tools that are heavily used in some domains. So, for example, there's a most excellent book by Mark Newman, who's also faculty at the University of Michigan, called Introduction to Networks. And it's really a tome, it's a very thick book where he shows you how using, you know, some heavy duty math and analytics, you can derive many network properties from knowledge of simple things such as the degree distribution. So you can actually derive what the size of the giant component will be given the degree distribution of the network, for example. It also looks a lot at different algorithms for detecting community structure and really grounds such approaches on, you know, kind of in a statistical way where you're looking at ensembles of many different network instantiations and looking at whether what you observe is actually significantly different from what you would see at random. On the economic side of things, Matthew Jackson, who's faculty at Stanford, has written an excellent book, Social and Economic Networks. And things that we really didn't get into that much are, but that the book covers, are things like what strategically, how, if the nodes are self-interested in maximizing the utility that they get from the network, how will the network be wired? Or if you're playing certain games, I mean, we did the simple cascade model, but what if you were playing Prisoner's Dilemma on a network? How does the network topology affect the outcomes? Um, then Laszlo Barabashi and his collaborators are writing more chapters of the wonderful network science book, which is aimed more at a beginner audience. So I think you could probably understand, no matter your background, a great portion of that book. So other topics that we didn't get to this time around include how networks evolve over time. So Gephi actually has some functionality for visualizing how networks evolve. But questions that you might be interested in is, does the community structure change? Does the network densify? That is, does it become denser over time? You can track centrality. So are there different nodes that emerge as being important during different time periods? So that's a whole area which it's sort of easy to extrapolate from where we are now to doing it over time, but I'm just sorry I didn't get a chance to do that with you this time around. So you know, another very fruitful part are these P-star models, where you statistically determine factors that are affecting network formation. So rather than saying, oh, okay, it's going to have this probability of preferential attachment, you're going to actually run an analysis that's going to extract that from the observed data. You know, is the network growing preferentially or not? Is triadic closure a large factor in how this network has formed. And finally, cool and unusual applications, they're happening every day, all the time. Um, Whether you want to understand what's happening in politics, in education, um, really, there's no limit to where you can apply network analysis. So I do hope you have found this class useful and that now you will go forth and apply social network analysis to whatever might interest you. So thanks for sticking with me through these weeks. Bye.